All right, guys, welcome back to almost the last video of this recording. And I hope you've been enjoying all the content that we've been going through together. I know there's so much more to go to in depth, but obviously with restrictions, we can't go into a lot of the content. So therefore, I'll be creating specialized videos just for you guys and just for everyone that sort of wants to know more content, not more material on specific areas. And I'll be going ahead and doing that as well for you guys over the next coming weeks. You'll be getting a bunch of free content from me if you want it. Talking about the security concepts, talking about packet injections, packet manipulation, bypassing, you know, products like Cloudflare and Mimecast, and all these other cool products that are out there on the perimeter, blocking attackers trying to do things. I'll be creating these videos around stuff that's worked really well for me doing the red teaming engagements on how to evade and bypass these sort of products. Now, without further ado, we're going to move on to remote access, and this is probably my favorite area. In attacking stuff is obviously a remote access and compromising other machines and getting access to them. So, in order for us to obviously get access or evade or bypass, firewalls or intrusion prevention detection systems, we first need to know how they work. And before I talk a bit about, creating the payload, enabling the server, and the victim initiating and building the connection, these are the three sort of steps that we have when we're creating a interpreted session or a reverse shell into that host or into that network or that machine. But before we even get to this level, I sort of want to take it a step back and just talk a bit about, some firewall concepts. So this is the diagram that I'm going to use for this. So I'm going to talk and demonstrate a few things. And I want you guys to sort of just in your head, and you might know already the traffic control methods that, we already have in place, and they probably are familiar to you, such as packet filtering, stateful inspection, and now we have the UTMs, the threat management systems, and obviously application awareness and content control. But what I really want to spend some time, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, just diving into the three main traffic controls that we see in a lot of production environments. And then once you understand the concepts of how the firewall works, then we'll move over into the payload execution. So then you obviously know how the firewall works. So we'll do a bit of a crash course around, how the firewall actually detects and, how we filter things with the firewall. And then we'll move over into the demo, into the attack side of things. So I thought this is quite beneficial because, I can't talk about the payload execution and I can't talk about, the evasion techniques unless you sort of understand how things work first. And there was a saying that, if you're going to steal a car, you better know how a car works. And, there was a time I remember, just a very quick, 2-minute story, but there was this, not too long ago, actually, it's probably within this year where I don't know how to drive manual. So some of you might laugh, but I can't drive manual. And my partner's brother was away, they were overseas somewhere with his wife. And I was actually over her house with her mum and we were just talking and stuff. And we had to move the car from the driveway. And the funniest thing was they looked at me saying, can you move the car? Because no one else knew how to drive manual. So I didn't know how to drive manual either, and we couldn't start it and that sort of stuff. And it was a Subaru, and yeah, so we had to put it into neutral, and then I had to roll it down the street, and then everyone's laughing at me because I couldn't drive it. So that goes back to the question of if you're going to steal a car, you better know how it's going to work, because once you get in there and you realize it's manual and you have no idea how to drive it, you're going to find yourself in a sticky situation. So going back to the networks or going back to compromising machines, the main thing is you need to understand how the network works. So in particular, now we're going to talk around firewalls. So we need to understand how the firewall operates and how it works, and going from there. So once you understand obviously how it's going to work, then you know what buttons to press to sort of maneuver yourself around that, because the automatic responses, how it's going to do things, the requests, that sort of stuff. And I'm not going to go into the full depths of the acknowledgements, the replies, the ICMP stuff. I'm just going to give you a high level overview of the three main traffic control methods, and then I'll talk in depth about them. But if there's anything more specific that you'd like to know more about those, reach out and obviously I'll create some more content around that. So just to start off, I'm going to start by highlighting this screen just so we can begin drawing and sort of demonstrating this. So the first area that I want to talk about is packet filtering. So packet filtering has been around since, I guess, the early 80s and 90s when it first sort of came out. And packet filtering has been the oldest form of, I'm just trying to think and write at the same time, packet filtering. So with packet filtering, so what would happen here is if we've got a machine here on the internal network, let's say that anything inside of our firewall right now, so anything behind this red line, is on the internal network. So this is, say, let's say it's a corporate office, and this is our internal office, okay? And we have Bob over here. So Bob's sitting over here. Now, there's a couple of things. When Bob basically boots up his machine, a couple of things will happen, right? So one will go into DHCP. So he'll obviously have to get an IP address assigned. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the OSI layer and specifically the hybrid TCP/IP model, so you guys can reference that from a holistic view of, you know, when Bob is going to a web browser or when he's going to the internet, what's he actually doing, or what does it actually look like from, you know, the TCP/IP stack? So the first step is DHCP. So obviously we need to assign an IP address to him, and we might have a DHCP server somewhere. So let's say this might be a DHCP server, which is basically going to hand out IP addresses to all the hosts on the network. Now, when Bob boots up, there's 4 main steps that this server will go through. One is, I'm just going to draw them out here so we can walk through them. So there's 4 little packets that go back and forth between Bob. So Bob over here and this DHCP switch server, so between this connection here. One is it will do a discover message. So when Bob initiates, and he will send out a discover message, and he will say, hey, I need an IP address. So a nice little, let me just clear the screen up a little bit so we can talk about this. So the very first packet that actually gets sent is a discover packet. So the discover packet will come from the user. So Bob over here will send, you know, packet 1 that says, hey, I need to discover an IP address. I need an IP address connected to the internet. And that's what it does. It says, hey, server, can you give me an IP address? And the server will respond back with an offer. So that's an offer. And we'll say, hey, you know, if you don't have this IP address, I'm going to give you this IP address. So it basically hands out an IP address from its pool. So just say it's 10, 10, 10, 10. And then the next packet from there would be a discover offer request. So he will send a request to him saying, hey, I don't have this IP address. I would like to request it, please. And basically saying, if it's not assigned, then I'll take it. And then the DHCP server on the other end says, cool, if you don't have it, then I'm going to acknowledge that and I'm going to assign you that IP address. So then we'll send him the acknowledgement saying, hey, I've now acknowledged that I've assigned you that 10, 10, 10, 10 IP address. You've requested it, you've acknowledged it. And that's the 4 little packets that actually go back and forth between the client. So these are all client, the blue is the client, and these 2 little packets over here is from the server. So 2 packets from the client, 2 packets from the server, 4 packets altogether coming back and forth between that little exchange. That's step 1. So it'll do a little DHCP and say, hey, I need an IP address. And once we have an IP address, we then connect to the internet. Step 2, we'll go through DNS. I'm not going to talk a lot about the DNS stuff, but we're going to do a DNS query that says, hey, I need to map, you know, yahoo.com to an IP address, right? So we don't know what that IP address is, which we'll go through the switching, the routing, and which I'm going to talk about in the next sort of slide. So let me just erase this, and I'll go back a slide so I can draw this out for you guys. So let me go back. Cool. So this is perfect. So when we talk about the OSI layer, there's a couple of things that we need to know about before we start playing with things, right? So in the traditional TCP/IP stack, we've got the 7 layers of the OSI layer. Now you might know these, but I want to go through with you together that we can sort of sit down and understand them in a little bit more depth than, you know, if you already do know them, that's great. But if you don't, then there's a little bit of a crash course right now. So we have the main application layer. So this is just a normal TCP IP stack that everyone on the planet knows. And I'm going to be using this as a reference. We have the network layer, or the hybrid, I should say the hybrid. So hybrid. So we've got the network layer, and underneath the network layer, we've got data link. And then obviously we've got the physical connection. Cool. So what actually happens when we have, so we've got a firewall here. And let's say on the internal network, we've got Bob over here on this machine, and this is Bob. And over here is the internet. And Bob's sitting on the network of 10.10.10. It's on a /24 network, and that's great. So when Bob powers up his machine, he's got his IP address now. He's done DNS queries, so he knows where he's going to. Now, the next step is the 5 tuples. So this is an easy way to remember this sort of stuff, because the 5 tuples essentially is the 5 things that we need in the network in order for things to communicate efficiently. Not efficiently, well, we need those parameters in order for things to exchange. So there's a couple of things we need. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Cool. The 5 tuples. So we need a couple of things. One is we need the source destination. So not the source destination. We need the source IP address. We need the destination IP address. We need the source port. We need the destination port. And we also need the protocol that's being exchanged, whether it's TCP or UDP, which I'll talk about those two. So the difference between TCP and UDP is a couple of things. One is, so with TCP, think of TCP as the aggressive sort of the aggressive girlfriend. She's constantly wanting attention. She's very aggressive with her communication, and she just wants things now. So I think of TCP being that aggressive predecessor, where he's just constantly going, hey, connect. I want to connect with you. Please connect with me. Can you connect? Connect. It's very connection orientated. That's why it's called the transmission control protocol, where it just wants to connect. So with TCP being that very aggressive state, it makes it a great protocol for reliability. So we know that the packets are obviously going to be exchanged, it's going to be delivered, and nothing's going to be dropped. Where on the other hand, UDP is very much the opposite, where we don't know if it's going to connect. It may drop a packet, it may drop 6, we don't know. And it's very dynamic. It'll be more of the lines of, yeah, I'll connect with you, but, and it'll sort of leave it at that, where TCP, you saw on the other hand, with TCP is just very aggressive, and it'll connect and it'll just want a session with you. Okay, so UDP on the other hand is very unreliable. They use a datagram protocol, and a lot of those protocols like DNS will use UDP, and all of other protocols I'm not going to talk about too much now, but they'll use UDP. Now, going back to the 5 tuples, these are the 5 tuples in every network. This is how things operate in the network. These are the things that we need in the network. We need a source IP address. We need the destination IP address. We need the ports, so the source port, the destination port, and obviously the protocol that we're exchanging with. So work with me on this for just a quick couple of minutes. So a lot of these parameters we're not going to have. So if we are going from, so if this is Bob over here, and Bob is going to, let's just say he's going over to YouTube. When Bob obviously goes to the browser, when we talk about at the application layer, so not even at the physical layer yet, or we can actually go this way up, but I'm not going to go that way. I'm actually going to go top down. So I'm going to go this way down the OSI layer, and we'll work through it together. So when Bob fires up a web browser and he goes to Chrome or Internet Explorer and he goes into youtube.com, a couple of things will happen. One is the application will start to launch. So whether he's using HTTP or HTTPS in the background, this will obviously be the application layer. So that's the application that's being used, is HTTP or HTTPS. At the transport layer, what protocol is being initiated with HTTP? So if you're saying, Andrew, at the transport layer, we are using TCP, I'm going to say, yes, you are absolutely correct. And specifically, if we're using HTTP, we're using port 80. And if we're using HTTPS, we're using 443. At the network layer, we need to know the destination IP address. So let's say in this example, it's 1.2.3.4. So we've got that. So 1.2.3.4. At the data link, we need obviously the destination MAC address. So we don't have that yet. But we'll obviously get that if we're doing a default route to this guy, and he obviously has that in his table, and he says, hey, here's the default route to me, just send me all your packets, and then I'll route it out to YouTube or to wherever I'm going to. So we need to know the destination MAC address, the layer 2 information, and the physical. Are we using what cables and the bits and the fiber and that sort of stuff as well? So when his machine powers up, he's going to go through a couple of things. One is it's going to generate its own source port. And the source port is basically a unique identifier that comes back to this host. When a packet goes out of the network, it needs to be referenced back to this host. So this host will then generate a source IP address greater than 1023. So it starts at 1024 and higher. So these are the well-known ports in the network. And today, I think there's 65,635 available ports on any given machine. So it basically picks a number with any of these. So it'll just randomly generate a number. So we need that number, and we need to know that number. And we'll go, that's the source port. So the source IP address is obviously this guy. So it's a 10.10.10.10 number, the internal IP address. Destination IP address is this guy over here. So that's what we're going to, 1.2.3.4. The source port is the locally generated number that we've created. So let's just say that Bob over here creates a source port of 3333. It goes over here. The destination port. So at this side of the application layer, we are going to HTTP in this case. So if we're going to be using port 80, that's the destination port. And the protocol, we're using TCP at the protocol layer. So they're that's the 5 essential ingredients that we're going to need in the network for things to communicate effectively. When the reply traffic comes back from YouTube, so when the request goes out from Bob, so Bob sends the request out to YouTube, and the reply traffic comes back, it basically gets sent back to the destination source, which is this guy, the source IP address. Once it gets routed through NAT, which I'm not going to go into the whole NAT concepts, through the global IP address, then it comes into the internal IP address. But it's basically destined for this source port right here. So that's how it identifies Bob. It says, hey, Bob is identified at this source port of 333, coming back from the destination of port 80. Okay, now I hope this makes a little bit of sense. So I'm going to go over into talking a little bit about the packet filtering. So going back to, let me open this up again. So going back to phase 1 of packet filtering. So packet filtering is one of the oldest methods of traffic filtering, right? So a firewall does one thing well, and it just filters the traffic, right? So it filters traffic from internal network, going out to the internet. You've got the DMZ here. Now we've got obviously zone bases. So Palo Alto does this very well. Cisco does this very well. Checkpoint does this very well. You assign zones to these interfaces, and then you can group these interfaces instead of creating new firewall rules and permissions and that sort of stuff. You basically assign zones to these interfaces. So as you grow the network, you can say, hey, any of these zones is considered the internal network. Any of these zones is considered the DMZ, for example. If you've got a DMZ zone, and anything that's considered out here, or these zones, these can be the potential outside interfaces. So you can group these very well. They work very well with a lot of the group permissions that you can create, and it's just very I was going to say automatic, but it's very scalable. You can do things very quickly on the fly. You don't have to recreate permissions and new rules and that sort of stuff. So with packet filtering, keeping in mind the 5 tuples that we just discussed, with packet filtering, when Bob generates that source IP address, the source port of 3333, and going to the destination port of YouTube, so he's going to YouTube at port 80 using TCP. The reply traffic coming back, so he sends his request out to YouTube. The reply traffic coming back is destined for Bob at 333. So he's on the internal network of 10.10.10. The issue with packet filtering is you need 2 packets. One is you need the reply traffic and the requested traffic. So at the firewall, you have to put two parameters in there to say, hey, I want to allow 10, 10, 10, 10 going to YouTube, right? Now, the issue with this is, as the network starts to grow and you know, obviously have a lot more rules in the firewall, it doesn't become very scalable in terms of I need now two rules to allow this traffic, plus I need to allow the return traffic as well. Now, the one of the biggest issues is this source port number, because because the source port is generated randomly. We don't know what that source port's going to be. So for a lot of administrators back in the day, was you'd poke a lot of holes in the firewall to allow these source ports to come back, and that's not a very good sign, because you're creating all these holes in the network, or specifically you're creating all these holes in the firewall for ports that you don't even know are going to be working. So, you know, if we've got 100 packets essentially coming into the network at a packet filtering level, the firewall over here is going to basically inspect 100% of those packets. So it will check the source and destination. And when we're talking about the OSI layer, so we have the application, got the transport, got the network, we've got, what's the other one? The data link, and then we've got the physical. So in the OSI layer, we're basically referencing packet filtering to these two layers of the OSI layer. So the network layer and the transport layer. So network layer, we're talking about source and destination IP addresses. And at the transport layer, we're talking about the control mechanisms, whether we're using TCP. So we'll look at all the TCP flags, all the SYN requests, and all making sure all the headers essentially in the TCP layer are all correctly set up. And obviously at the network layer, which we're looking at the destination IP address and the source IP address. Now, with the network layer, I still think there's still a lot of caveat between packet filtering working more at the transport layer than the network layer. I sort of disagree with this. I still think that when we're talking about packet filtering works more granular at the network layer than it does a lot more at the transport layer. So I don't think it inspects as much as it should. It looks more of the destination IP address, the source IP address information, rather than just how the actual flags of the TCP, you know, the transport layer, TCP specifically headers are actually aligned. So that's essentially packet filtering. So packet filtering will have two rules that says, hey, I need to allow both ends of the network, and I've got to put those permissions into the firewall. Now, obviously, you can see at a scalable level, that's going to be very difficult to do, going back to the source port that gets generated by that host. Okay. Now, by default, every single firewall that exists to date actually has an implicit drop. So anything that this firewall doesn't know, or anything that you haven't explicitly permitted in its firewall rules, will obviously drop the packet. And that's a good sign, because, you know, if I've got Andrew over here, that's an attacker, and I'm sitting on this network of, you know, 23, well, what was that? 23.1.2.3. And I'm trying to source packets from this IP address into the network, the firewall over here is going to raise its flag and say, whoa, 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 whoa. I don't have a rule permitting 23. In fact, I've never seen 23 trying to connect to the internal network. Therefore, it's going to drop the packet. So it won't even acknowledge, it won't even send a request back to this guy saying, hey, I've dropped your packets. It'll just drop it. Now, there's ways to obviously knock on the door of this firewall and make sure that, hey, is it doing any sort of filtering, which I'm not going to talk about right now. But by default, if the rule hasn't been explicitly permitted, meaning if an administrator hasn't gone in there and said, hey, please permit 10.10.10, going from the internal network, going to out here to the branch office, using a specific protocol port, and the permission is to accept that traffic or to drop it, then it's going to go through the implicit drop. So the implicit rule says, hey, anything that I don't know, I'm just going to drop that. So the firewalls work essentially in a top-down approach. You look at the first rule, doesn't match, yes, no, doesn't match, yes, no, doesn't match, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. So up until the point where it actually matches the traffic, does it get allowed through the firewall. So top-down approach, implicit rule is always there by default. If it doesn't know it, it will drop the packet. So that's packet filtering. Now, let's go over and talk a little bit about the stateful inspection. So stateful inspection is where, so number one is packet filtering. We've just spoken about that. Number two is stateful inspection. So stateful inspection is used In probably around 95% of prod environments that you sort of work with, or I've worked with. Stapling inspection is basically around, yeah, 95% of all production environments right now. And stapling inspection just says now that, hey, as a reply traffic comes from Bob, so with Bob being here at 10, 10, 10, 10, on the 10 network, and he's on the /24 network here, and he's generated a source port of 3333, and he's going out to YouTube over here at 1.2.3.4. That's on port 80 because we're using HTTP. Now, what this firewall is now going to do with stapling inspection is going to say, hey, I'm going to build a table. And in this table, I'm going to have an entry that says, I have a source IP address coming from 10.10.10.10, coming from a source port of 3333, going to 1.2.3.4 with a destination port of 80. And it'll put this in a little table called the state table. And it'll basically remember this inspection. So it'll remember these 5 tuples essentially coming from this host, going to wherever he's going. And the cool thing about this is when we start talking about the proper 3-way handshake, so the TCP, SYN, the request, SYN-ACK, and ACK-ACK, I'm not going to go into the full depth of how that happens and then the graceful shutdown period once it ends. But basically, it sends a request. It says, hey, I want to connect with you if this is the normal 3-way handshake. So we've like we've got a file server over here, a file server that we're connecting to, whether it's email or a file exchange server somewhere, and we're exchanging information on that server. It's going to go through the 3-way handshake specifically for TCP. So TCP will have a 3 little packets that go back and forth. It says, hey, I request that I want to use port 80 on you, and I'm going to send you a packet that says, hey, I initially want to connect with you on port 80. Then the server responds back with an acknowledgement with the proper sequence numbers and acknowledgement numbers. I'm not going to go into the full depth of this. Then obviously with an acknowledgement saying, hey, I've obviously now acknowledged you wanting to connect with me. The proper traditional approach is the 3 requests. So you've got the request, the acknowledgement, and finally the ACK. So it's the acknowledgement of the acknowledgement. Now with stapling inspection, it will look at this in the traditional form set. So once we know what the 3, so with TCP, it uses the 3-way handshake. Now, if none of those flags have been changed, so for example, the 3-way handshake goes like this. So we'll go request, SYN-ACK comes back, and the final acknowledgement between these 2. Okay, now let's say, for example, we get a packet that's done this. So I'm just going to change color. So we've got a request that we want to connect, and then we received a SYN-ACK. And what happens if this guy now sends a null or a push or a fin? So with traditional 3-way handshake, it will say, hey, I'll accept the packet if it comes back, if it's the correct packet. So TCP works like this. So it says, hey, I want to request. The second packet is a SYN-ACK. And obviously the third packet is an acknowledgement. Now, if it sees something that doesn't look authentic or doesn't look like the real 3-way handshake, it's going to drop that. So with stapling inspection, it says, hey, I'm going to dynamically allow the traffic to come back into the network, but it must match the 3-way handshake parameters. If it doesn't, the packet will be dropped. And that's cool. So it'll build its state table and say, hey, I've seen that this IP address going to this destination at this port. That way, when the reply traffic comes back, it's destined to this host at 333 with this obviously internal IP address of 10.10.10.10. So the reply traffic now gets dynamically allocated, dynamically returned, I should say. So we don't have to create another rule to allow the reply traffic to come back, which is pretty cool. So I can create one rule. The firewall then will build its own state table. And I think in memory, it stores this for about 300 seconds, which is about 5 minutes. And this is quite handy once we're doing attacks. And I know for a lot of IPS evasion specifically, that we can do stuff with session splicing where a lot of the IPSs right now have maybe a 15 to 16 second time memory. And you can evade things, which I'm not going to go to in the depth of now, because right now that I'll spend another 10 minutes talking about that, but it's really irrelevant right now. So that's essentially stateful inspection. So it'll build its own state table and it will allow the reply traffic to come back into the network if it looks correct. So in making sure that all the SYNAC replies, the acknowledgements are all correctly doing what TCP should and will known do, right? Now the final step is what we're starting to see a lot more is the UTMs, Unified Threat Management, and we've also now got application awareness and content awareness. So with content awareness, we have people that are very sneaky. Let me put it that way. So when we start talking with developers and other sort of security people, people find ways of evading parameters. So with application content now, we can have specifics looking at the application content of that packet or the payload. So if we have an administrator, let me just clear the screen off here and then we can, all right. So let me go over to application awareness. So, all right. So with application awareness, if we've got a firewall that says, hey, I'm blocking Telnet. Now, anyone on the internal network trying to access Telnet on port 23, please go ahead and drop that packet. But that's rule number 1. Rule 2 says, hey, anyone that's using HTTP on port 80, please go ahead and allow that packet. So what Dave over here can do is, at the transport layer, when we talk about the OSI layer, so going back to the application, the transport, the network, data link, and the physical. When we start looking at the transport layer, so Dave over here, he's a developer, and if we've blocked Telnet for him to use, and he's got a home machine over here, what Dave can do is he can basically tunnel out using masquerading. So he can masquerade his payload. Masquerade. I don't know how to spell, guys. It's not an English exam, so don't judge me on my spelling. So he's basically going to masquerade his traffic at the transport layer, saying, "Hey, instead of using port 23 for Telnet, why don't you use port 80?" So he can use tools like some cool tools, Scapy and HPing 3 specifically. These are basically packet manipulators in the network. So I can create basically my own packets and I can start sending things into the network with different IP addresses, source IP addresses, different layer 2 addresses, and just seeing how things work. And I can, at this stage now, I can start manipulating the traffic and I can basically assign different traffic or different protocols at the transmission layer when a payload or a packet goes through the network. And that's what Dave can do. So Dave can basically reroute it, well, retranslate or masquerade his traffic to say, hey, I know that the firewall that Telnet's being disabled. However, I know that HTTP is being enabled, and I'm just going to tunnel out using HTTP. So when he gets over here, when the packet gets to this web server, he may have a tool on there or a little software that says, hey, anything coming in from this IP address or this host or whatever identifier he has, he can then decrypt that or de-encapsulate that, and then it's basically a Telnet payload or whatever it may be. So people can be very sneaky in the way they masquerade things, or they'll start sending things out of your network. You need to obviously pick those up and understand those, that these things actually do happen. And and I can talk very well on Checkpoint on this because I was an instructor for a little while, that Checkpoint now has SSL inspection. So what they can do is, before the packet even leaves the firewall, says, hey, this is an encrypted packet coming in. I'm going to decrypt it at the firewall layer. So I'm going to basically slice out that session. I'm going to inspect the payload. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to inspect it at the application layer now. And I'm then going to make my own connection out to where it needs to go. So it acts basically like a little proxy. And that's why you want it to do it. So it'll basically build its own connection out to where it needs to go. The reply traffic comes back in, and then the firewall will then build its own connection back to whoever requested it. Basically inspecting every bit of information right here in the center. And then you can tie in DLP stuff. You can tie in geographical locations, so any malicious IP addresses coming in from foreign countries that you shouldn't be having access to. We're speaking about SSL, and then you can tie that in with mobile access policies or remote policies as well. So people coming in through mobile phones, identity access management. So then you can inspect things at the firewall at much more granularity, and you can obviously have threat prevention mechanisms as well now, and the list goes on. So where am I going with this? Application awareness. Now we get into the specifics of the actual application. So once it sees Telnet coming in at port 80, it's going to say, well, port 23 is assigned to Telnet because that's what I know Telnet looks like. Once it sees that at the transport layer being port 80, it's going to raise some red flag and say that's not allowed because I know Telnet comes in at port 23. So we have obviously the list of locations where it gets this information from, whether it's the cloud, it's publicly available, and it'll just have a list of, or a laundry list of allowable protocols and what they're known to look like. And then we get into the specifics of now, once the user is using specific applications, what can they now do once they're in that application? Can they upload content? Can they download material? And you can get very granular on category matching as well. So if they're going to malicious websites, or category A, B, C might be, gaming, or category D may be, explicit content, that sort of stuff. So you can create things on categories, and it will basically create a group of what's known to be gaming profiles, and you can assign specific parameters within that, whether they're allowed to access certain content, what can they do once they're inside that content, and getting really granular on even the users now. So once the user has access to this, like, where do we know where the users are actually coming in from? So we're gonna have parameters now with identity awareness that says, hey, is this really Bob coming in from this network? And we'll start challenging a lot of those parameters around the network, so the network IP address, it will have the hosts, it will have, username and password combinations, and there's multiple parameters within that. I'm not going to go into the depths of it, but there's ways of putting in the right identity awareness mechanisms to say, hey, if Bob is really coming in from here, please prove it. And that's what we want to do. We want to do constant challenge approval where, if it's not really Bob coming in from there, then we want to know about it. And then we want to be very specific on what are the IP address and host that this guy is coming from, what's the usernames. We want to do Active Directory queries and making sure that it's the right user account that's coming in. If if you have your own AD environment in-house and on-prem, and that sort of stuff. So that's the three essential packet filtering and control methods that we have right now. We've got packet filtering that we've discussed. We've got stateful inspection that's used in 95 to 98% of environments, and now we've got the more behemoth side of things, which is the application awareness and application content control. All right, so with a bit of a crash course, I'm now going to go back into our remote access demonstration. And there's basically three little parameters that we need for this thing to execute very well. We need to obviously create the payload. So there's client-side attacks, there's non-client-side attacks, and then we have now application-side of attacks where we start leveraging JavaScripts and end-user applications like LinkedIn and that sort of stuff. So the first step is we need to create a payload. So I'm going to use basically one tool that I found that works really well for me, and there's a boatload of tools out there that people create payloads with. There's no one size fits all, if that makes sense. I've just found that MSF Venom for myself just works really well. I'll create a payload with it, and I'll walk you through the actual parameters of how I actually do that in a demo. So we're going to use MSF Venom to create the payload, and then we're going to use MSF Console, which is basically the Metasploit framework. And Metasploit framework is basically a library list of exploits and obviously vulnerabilities that a lot of the security researchers out there in the community. And I think to date, I think it must have been a couple of weeks ago when I actually researched how many active updates Metasploit actually gets in a month. And almost maybe about 20 years ago, it probably was receiving maybe 100K of updates a month. That's researchers going, hey, we found specific vulnerabilities within XYZ. There's, scanning mechanisms, SNMP, SSH brute forcing. Then there's the post-exploitation modules. To now almost being, I think, 400,000 to 500,000 updates per month. So that gives you the level of knowledge, or the depth of the library that we have at our disposal with Metasploit. And I was sort of lost for words because I couldn't find the right word to actually explain like the depth of 500,000 updates a month. Like that's just incredible to comprehend how many researchers are out there, updating and sharing knowledge with each other. It's just amazing to be a part of this community. And Metasploit works really well when you're doing some attacks, and if you're not attacking a lot of victims or a lot of sessions coming back and forth to you. Where on the other hand, using Armitage. Now, um, Armitage, I don't know if it's AG or IG. I've had the actual privilege of speaking to Raphael Marge, and Raphael Marge is the creator of Cobalt Strike, and he's the creator of Armitage. And if you guys just Google Raphael Marge, he's just basically a red teamer that created Armitage for this specific reason, because using Metasploit and having this library at your disposal, it ended up getting very clunky with the way you'd work with it. Meaning, when I was in a shell, when a lot of these security people are in, full remote access shell sessions, it gets to the point where you sort of lose track, lose focus where you are, and you sort of see that in the demo where I'm going to demonstrate. If I've got maybe 30, 40 different hosts I'm trying to connect to, you sort of lose track of where things are. Where Armitage is a very graphical, nice, neat, collaborative tool that you can sort of work with, where you can just have a boatload of little tabs open within one console. So you were saying in Metasploit framework, it's basically a command line, and you have to keep going into the session. Then you've got to go into the background. You've got to go back out of the session, and then you got to go back in again and redo some stuff, and then talk Linux, and then talk Mac, and then talk Windows. Then you got to go back out, recreate a thing, and it just gets very lost. So you can just lose yourself very easily if you're not very experienced. Where with Armitage, you've got basically one console, and you've got all these little hosts that you're interacting with, and it just works to a tree. You can group them together and say, hey, that's one. You might have these two, group them together, and it's just an incredible collaborative red teaming, just little Swiss Army knife tool that you can use for post exploitation and compromising hosts and machines. And big credit, and it's big privilege being able to chat to Raphael Marge and get into his mindset. He's just an incredible chap, and he's done some amazing things, over his years. And Cobalt Strike being one of them, and Armitage being the other. And it was just amazing to get into his mindset of why did he actually create that, and obviously his frustration of the same thing, where we just couldn't do our role correctly. So kudos to you, Raphael. Big shout out to him. And you guys, if you want to know more about him, just Google Raphael Marge and obviously get to know him a little bit as well through his work. So going back to this, is creating the payload is step one. So we create the payload. There's two little forms, two little steps that we go through. We basically, these two work hand in hand. So once we create the payload, we then tie the payload to Metasploit or to our framework. We enable our server. So in this case, I'm going to enable Apache. And this basically says, hey, when the user connects into me, so if we've got Bob over here, so this is Bob. And once Bob connects to our web server, he's then going to download the little exe that we're going to create. And then he then goes and stores that thing on his machine. So there's multiple ways of getting him that payload. But in this example, I've just created a little web server where he goes to the IP address of my Kali Linux box, whatever it is, 192.168.1. I've got the number, but he goes to that IP address, and then he downloads the exe, which is the vulnerable thing, the exploit of that Win7 machine, and then he'll run that, and then we get a shell, and then we can basically interact with that machine. So now that we know how the firewall works, we want the victim to initiate the session, because when we have the firewall, being the attacker out here on the internet, we can't initiate packets going into the network. We can't source them because the firewall has an implicit drop rule, and it says, hey, if I'm seeing a packet coming in from 6, 7, 8, 9, I don't know who you are. I haven't seen anything coming in from a trusted zone, being the internal network. Therefore, I'm not allowing this to come in through here, so it'll drop the packet. So we want the victim over here to then go ahead and dynamically, like we spoke about. So especially that we know that potentially this firewall could be using application awareness, it could be using step inspection, we don't know, and that's through our reconnaissance mechanisms that we'll start poking the holes in this firewall and say, hey, what things do you have open, and what sort of things are you filtering, and what are you doing? So we'll learn through that. We'll obviously learn what the firewall is doing. In this example, I'm not doing that because it's just for demonstration's sake, we want the victim to initiate the session to us. So that's obviously coming in through a trusted connection, being the internal side of the network. And then once that happens, the replied traffic is dynamically learned and it's allowed back into the network. So essentially then that's how we compromise beautiful Bob. All right, and that's pretty much it, guys. So if I've gone too quick with this remote access little slide and obviously going for about 20 minutes or so, if I've gone a bit too fast or if you think I've missed something or if you're unsure about a specific area of content that I've spoken about, reach out, let me know, and I can do another session with you on a one-on-one, or I can create a video on some FAQs or some content things that you should be aware of when you're dealing with stateful inspection firewalls or application control firewalls and what you should be doing and what you don't do. It's just such a lengthy topic that I can talk days and days on this. It's just, we're so time constricted, 20 minutes on a specific area and we're going to move on. So if you want to see any other specifics, let me know. I hope this has made sense. And now we're going to go into the demo side of things. I hope it's going to be so much fun for you. I know it was a lot of fun for me doing this. So I'll see you guys very soon.